I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. This week, the talented Mrs. Mandelbaum, the author Margalit Fox's latest book. She chronicles the life of Jewish immigrant Frederica Mandelbaum. She became one of America's great organized crime bosses during New York's Gilded Age. Margalit Fox, a former New York Times senior obituary writer. But first, Republicans dominated the news cycle this week following Donald Trump's astonishingly narrow yet triumphant escape from an assassin's bullets. On the Democratic side, President Biden contracted COVID for the third time, casting further doubt on his candidacy. Joining us to discuss the political waves running through Washington, New York Times Congressional Correspondent Annie Karni. And of course, we're talking when we can be overtaken by events at any moment. Annie, you wrote in the Times the other day that JD Vance, who was a writer, writing about hillbilly elegy in his brief time in the Senate, used his brief tenure to showcase what you said was his willingness to embrace the MAGA agenda, to impress Donald Trump, which obviously he did. So who is the real J.D. Vance? Is he the author of Hillbilly Elegy? Is he someone who wants to impress Trump? Whom do we believe?
I think what matters is he's a very ambitious, very smart, unorthodox character with an incredible narrative, an incredible personal story of how he got where he is today, who's willing to bend himself to the current moment, has incredibly ambitious. He was described to us as someone whose ambition was notable even in the Senate, where 100 people look in the mirror and see a future president. Senators are all very ambitious, and he stood out. So this is someone who is a talented political operator who is willing to do what it takes to rise in his party, and that means falling in line with Trump and the MAGA movement. He established himself as a isolationist, and really the main issue that defined his short 18 months in the Senate was his opposition to sending aid to Ukraine. He was the most outspoken senator on that issue. He lost legislatively. His colleagues passed a huge supplemental to send $60 billion to Ukraine, but he won in terms of the prize he won this week. He appealed to Trump, who saw someone who, represented that populist base. And most people saw his time in the Senate as really like an 18-month audition for Trump. Not a legislative record to point to, but the Ukraine stance. And then at home, he sort of took a very populist anti-business stance when it came to trying to pass a rail safety legislation after the crash in East Palestine that also rankled more traditional Republicans. So he kind of proved himself. I think in terms of who's the real JD Vance, I think we should assume it's a guy who will do anything for Trump. I think we should assume it's a guy who, in the same situation Mike Pence was in on January 6th, would agree not to certify the election.
So we really don't know where he stands. He is a different person, perhaps, or transactional in his ideology. Is that fair to say?
I think so. I mean, he's not stupid. He's a very smart guy. So one question I have just watching him is, will we see someone who we've seen? There's two versions, like Mike Johnson, who is now the Speaker of the House. We saw him change dramatically from a rank and file, hard right member from a red state to making more difficult decisions because he's Speaker of the House, and with greater power comes greater responsibility. He ended up doing the right thing on Ukraine, again, bucking the hard right of his party, taking a vote that was the opposite of what he had believed before he had that job and had access to the intelligence and the briefings that a leader has. Will JD Vance, in stepping into a larger role that he might have to play at certain times as vice president, make a more responsible decision, for instance, in a situation like Mike Pence was in? We'll see. But I think the reason he appealed to Trump was because of loyalty. And this is a guy he trusts will have his back, will trust, um, will everyone said bad things about Trump in the past, but I mean the pick is because it's someone who he believes is fervently hard right and will be undyingly loyal.
Trump cannot run for another term after this if he wins. JD Vance as his vice presidential running mate, does he become the heir apparent? And does that mean that Trumpism continues regardless of Trump?
I think yes, he is now the heir apparent to this movement. That's another thing this pick indicates. If he had picked Doug Burgum, that's not really someone who's going to lead this movement. Marco Rubio is and no more has been on the national stage for 10 years, like has his own brand, was seen as the potential future leader of the party in a much different moment for the Republican Party. JD Vance now has the mantle of the MAGA movement. Um, Whether or not it follows him and he can lead it the way Trump can after Trump is, we'll see what his political talents are in terms of being able to lead it. Whether other people will come and, I mean, it's not like you are handed the presidency if you're the vice president. But yes, I think for right now, he chose someone, he's 39 years old. I mean, this is a young leader, really untested. He's been in the Senate for 18 months. I mean, he is going to define himself now over the next years and has the opportunity to be the leader of the movement after Trump.
Annie, how do Republicans in the Congress react to the choice? Do they see the ticket now as strong enough to retake the House, keep the Senate, or take the Senate rather? And are there big gaps between where congressional Republicans stand and the Republican platform?
I think it's a confident choice. JD Vance, compared to the other people that were publicly being considered, does the least in terms of expanding the map for Trump. This is not someone to appeal to those suburban moderate voters. This is not someone picked to appeal to women or doesn't have a more moderate stance on abortion or any issue. This is the pick of someone who looks like he's cruising into the presidency right now, while Democrats are completely in disarray, truly, and doesn't need to expand, can just pick who he wants and appeal to the base. So that's what this pick is. And yeah, I think right now the mood here, I'm in Milwaukee right now. The mood here is unity. The mood is confident and happy, and the other side is imploding. I think that Democrats and Republicans alike are both right now anticipating a high likelihood that unless things change dramatically, Republicans have a decent shot at winning both houses in both chambers in Congress and the White House. I think that JD Vance was not particularly popular with Republican leadership. He, opposed Mitch McConnell and John Thune on Ukraine aid, which is Mitch McConnell's main reason for staying around, sticking around. So I think there's concern that this is bad for Zelensky potentially, good for Putin potentially, and concern among Senate Republicans that they will have to kind of play a role, a check on the White House if in terms of the issue of Ukraine, because Senate Republicans are not on the same page with JD Vance about wanting to oppose aid there.
Democrats obviously are in a fluid situation at the moment. Do they feel the selection of J.D. Vance helps Trump or simply solidifies the base that he already has?
That's a good question. I haven't talked to Democrats that much since the pick was announced about JD Vance because they're just incredible. I mean, they have bigger problems to worry about than does JD Vance help Trump right now. I think that they're probably happy with the pick. In a normal moment for them, this would be an easy person to run Oppo on. This is a guy who called the president America's Hitler. I mean, they have plenty to choose from in terms of running the tape on things Vance has said about Trump in the past. They have plenty of very extreme views to pick from on abortion. Reproductive rights is supposed to be the winning issue for Democrats. Um, they have plenty to hit him on. So I think probably in a normal moment where they're running a campaign highlighting the problems on the other side, this is a great, Democrats would be happy with this pick. Um, but right now they have so much more to worry about.
I'll bet they do. Annie
Yeah.
Karni from Milwaukee, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up next, New York City's godmother of organized crime. During America's Gilded Age and well before the 5 families of organized crime were divvying up New York, a poor Jewish immigrant mother of 4 rose to power. In her latest book, The Talented Mrs Mandlebaum, The Rise and Fall of an Organized Crime Boss, former New York Times book review editor and senior obituary writer Margalit Fox chronicles the remarkable life of Frederica Marm Mandelbaum. Welcome and thanks for joining us. The Times called it a book that revels in Dickensian detail of the demi-monde, a great review too in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. Now, we're talking about a person who was handicapped in many ways. She was an immigrant, she was a woman, she was Jewish. How did she rise to be a powerful organized crime boss?
That's right. Xenophobia, of course, is nothing new, and immigrants in Frederica Mandelbaum's time, she came here in steerage in 1850 with little more than the clothes on her back. Many immigrants were disenfranchised from well-paying, safe, decent jobs, and men at least could climb what historians have called the crooked ladder, making their way in the underworld as a way to provide for themselves and their families. And there were any number of jobs they could have done, running bucket shops, numbers joints, all kinds of gambling operations, hired muscle for Tammany Hall. For women who in desperation sought to climb the crooked ladder, the only 2 choices were shoplifting and prostitution. Neither one of those was going to be right for a determined, proper married woman like Mrs. Mandelbaum. So she not only climbed the crooked ladder, she had to build that ladder first.
What did her husband do?
Both she and her husband in the old country, in what is now central Germany, were poor village Jews. Her husband, Wolf, was a peddler, went out on the road, returning in time for the Sabbath. And in New York, they both plied that trade. They were peddlers in the bustling, noisy, crowded streets of the Lower East Side. Frederica Mandelbaum sold lace door to door for several years. It is very clear that she recognized early that if she remained a peddler, she and her family would stay in poverty forever. So by the end of her first decade in America, about 1859, she began reselling for good profit goods that had been pilfered or scavenged in this underground street economy that prevailed in New York then. She was smart enough not to ask where those goods had come from, and she quietly sold them on to waiting customers. She had become a fence.
Now, offense, it's a word I never quite understood. What is the derivation of offense?
Offense.
And now a historian, as you point out, called her a mogul of illegitimate capitalism.
That's right. At bottom, this is really a business story. I knew going in it was women's history. I knew going in it was true crime. But above all, this turned out to be a kind of Horatio Alger, rags to riches story, stood on its head about enterprise. Offense is a receiver of stolen goods, and they are the cash machines of their era. Their primary function is to convert contraband into clean, untraceable money. And the word fence, in this sense, derives from defense, spelled with a C in the British way, because offense acts as a double layer of insulation. First, between the thief who is stealing on their behalf and the police, and second, in selling the goods on, a layer of insulation between the thief and the consumer.
The Times called her the nucleus and center of the whole organization of crime in New York. Now, how did she rise to that position? It must have taken a lot of connections, not just in the underworld.
She rose step by step, and Frederica Mandelbaum had a genius for putting her finger to the wind and seeing what the social and economic conditions were in New York and in America more generally. Here we have the later years of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of a new middle class, the rise of mass-produced consumer goods that middle class is being taught to crave. But when you are under pressure to acquire all this stuff for your bourgeois household, you don't want to pay whole price or even full wholesale price. So you visit your friendly neighborhood fence.
Was she any worse than the robber barons uptown in terms of morality?
This is what struck me in researching the book. Downtown, in the so-called underworld, you have Mrs. Mandelbaum and operators like her making a living, a very, very good living. She became a millionaire in 1890s dollars through illicit activity. Uptown, in their gilded marble mansions on Fifth Avenue, are the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the titans of industry of the Gilded Age. But how have they won their uptown fortunes? Often through bribery, coercion, breaking up strikes, often with fatal consequences, cornering markets, making hostile takeovers. Yet, for these patrician white men, what they are doing is considered above the law.
Right, and capitalism. One of the things you point out is that her greatest caper, 1869, was not moving goods per se, but actually a robbery. How did she move from fencing goods to actually stealing something?
This is a canonical example of how she surveyed the market. She knew what the market would bear in terms of underworld commerce, and she responded accordingly. She started small, handling shoplifted goods. When that went well, she developed her organization to steal immense bolts of expensive silk from textile firms. And it should be noted that she is running the show, but not stealing herself. She quickly built an organization that extended nationally of shoplifters, jewel thieves, housebreakers, and eventually bank burglars. What got her into bank burglary was the awareness that with the advent of the Civil War in 1861, the Union desperately needed to raise money to wage that war. So suddenly, the United States, which until then had been on the gold standard, was flooded with newly printed paper money, greenbacks. Well, until that time, strikingly, bank burglary and safecracking had been rare because it's very impractical for a man to plunder a mess of gold and then go clanking noisily down the street. Suddenly, there was lightweight, whisper quiet paper money that had enormous value relative to its weight. The underworld, including Mar Mandelbaum, snapped to attention, and she knew, time to rob a bank.
Corruption on the street required corruption at a higher level, did it not? Organized crime required organized corruption.
That's exactly right. Organized crime has never been able to survive in isolation. It has to forge ties with the so-called upper world, the world of legitimate commerce. And that was no different in Mar Mandelbaum's day. She would give these lavish dinner parties in the opulent private apartments in which she raised her family above her modest haberdashery shop on the corner of Clinton and Rivington Streets that was the front for her more lucrative business. And around her groaning table, waited on by her servants, drinking fine wines from her cellars, were not only the creme de la creme of criminality, the nation's foremost jewel thieves and housebreakers and bank burglars in evening dress. Down the other side of the table, also in evening dress, were the uptown captains of industry, Wall Street men, high-level Tammany politicians, and high-level members of the police department.
Margalit, you talk about her relationship to religion. I'm not sure how devout she was, but how did she reconcile that with her profession?
Well, here I can only guess because I can't be inside her head. She was smart enough not to leave any personal papers that anyone has ever found. My educated guess...
Don't you hate that?
It is difficult. A narrative nonfiction writer's first port of call is always personal papers, but she was shrewd enough to know in her line of work, you do not commit anything to print.
Right.
And my educated guess, after spending years with this material, is that she saw no dissonance between her genuine, ardent faith as a newly American Jew, as she was from a very traditional Jewish family in the old country. And it's all about providing for your family, making sure your children do better than you did, providing for your community. She was, by all accounts, a generous benefactor to her synagogue. So I don't think she saw anything that had to be reconciled. There's something very moving about her faith. When, in the last 10 years of her life, she was a fugitive from the law, American society had changed, the district attorney and law enforcement finally caught up with her, and she went on the lam. One of her daughters died in New York, and Mar Mandelbaum came in disguise, covertly, back to New York at great risk of arrest to see her daughter's funeral and say goodbye to her dead child. Marm's entourage, knowing that the story of the death had been in the papers, police would be watching Jewish burial grounds around the city for Marm's presence, and so they could nab her. Her entourage suggested, let's give your daughter a Christian burial instead. They won't be looking there. Mrs. Mandelbaum would have none of it. She insisted that her child be buried in accordance with their faith, as indeed she was.
Fascinating. Do we have any idea what happened to the other three children?
I was able to trace the family down 2 generations to the generation of Mar Mandelbaum's grandchildren. And in the 1920s, one of her granddaughters had several arrests, one for passing a bad check, another time she was sent to Rikers Island for stealing a fur muff, a crime very much of its period. And of course, the newspapers had a field day making the connection between the very petty crimes of this young woman and her notorious, far more criminal grandmother.
Very, very quickly, how did they let her out on bail and then she escaped to Canada?
She had a lot of friends with a lot of money, and bail was paid. There wasn't a great deal that could be done, and the fact that she was out set in motion the greatest caper of her life, which was her flight from America.
Margalit Fox, the book is called The Talented Mrs Mandlebaum, The Rise and Fall of an American Crime Boss. If you care about New York history, and a woman's gumption, you'll like this enlightening tour of New York City history. Coming up next, my thoughts on the presidential face-off. If Donald Trump loses by a whisker in November, you could blame his defeat on JD Vance's beard. For more than a century, since the invention of the safety razor, and since American women won the right to vote, no presidential candidate with facial hair has won the White House. No mustachioed candidate has been elected president since William Howard Taft. Taft left office with his handlebar intact in 1913. Charles Evans Hughes was the last bearded major party presidential nominee, and he lost to Woodrow Wilson in 1916. New York Governor Tom Dewey's toothbrush mustache might have cost him the presidency in 1944 and 1948. It evoked Hitler and Hirohito. Worse, Alice Roosevelt Longworth immortalized the caricature by repeating that the priggish Republican nominee reminded her of the little man atop the wedding cake. Dewey's fellow Republican Herbert Hoover went further. He said, quote, "A man couldn't wear a mustache like that without having it affect his mind." Trump, no fan of facial hair himself, allowed recently that Vance, quote, "looks good, like a young Abraham Lincoln." Lincoln did set a precedent. Every president, from Lincoln through Taft, sported a beard or mustache or both, except for two: Andrew Johnson, who was impeached, and William McKinley, who was assassinated. But the last bearded presidential nominee to win was Benjamin Harrison in 1888. Now, I've got no personal objection to facial hair. When I shave, having a mustache protects me from slitting my upper lip. But academic researchers conclude that some voters are swayed by beards, mustaches, even sideburns. Yes, they make some young candidates look more mature, but they also suggest a gratuitous display of testosterone-fueled masculinity that worries women. Douglas Brinkley, the presidential scholar, told me the other day that some conservatives view facial hair as a cosmetic response to what they consider the nation's macho deficit. It's a way to counter same-sex marriage, transgender rights, other LGBTQ agendas. It says, "I'm not an elite sissified intellectual." It says, Brinkley maintains, "I am a caveman, heterosexual male." Well, if that's what you're looking for in a candidate, okay. In the Times, the author Jamie Malinowski once pointed out another reason to be wary. He wrote, "Nearly everyone we have gone to war with has had facial hair." For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.